Brooks of the NAACP speaking this afternoon in Charleston. To talk more about the definition of this crime and why it matters, I'm joined by Daryl Johnson. He's a former senior analyst with the Department of Homeland Security. He is also an author. Johnson wrote Right-Wing Resurgence: How a Domestic Terrorist Threat is Being Ignored. Daryl Johnson joins me now from Washington. So Daryl, tell me a little bit about that and why it's important in your mind that the Department of Justice look at this through that domestic terrorist lens.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your show, Andrew. Domestic terrorism is often misunderstood in the media as well as our government leaders and in the general public. There's many definitions of terrorism, but there's three main criteria that need to be met for an incident to become terrorism. Number one, it's got to be a violent act with a political or social cause or agenda to it. And lastly, it has to instill fear in the general population or attempt to influence government policy. So we see in this Charleston shooting attack, all three criteria was met. And an additional factor that I would throw in is the fact that this facility that was targeted is a historical church among the African American community and has symbolic value. So again, terrorists often target attacks against symbols that are part of a faith-based community or part of the government. So they look for iconic symbols, and this church definitely fits that criteria.
And so yesterday there was talk that this was a hate crime. Today the Department of Justice saying looking at all angles, including domestic terrorism. Is that an important distinction?
I think so. You know, officials that were investigating this shooting gave a preliminary assessment that it was a hate crime. I think that was a great designation in the beginning, but as more and more details start to unfold, we start seeing the belief system that was behind this attack by this young man. And so, you know, the fact that he has belief systems that drove him to go and attack the African Americans in that church, you know, meets the definition of terrorism and shows that there was a social or political agenda behind the attack.
Now, can you just walk me through, without getting into too many details, but in terms of how this plays out? So the Department of Justice says they're looking at it at all angles, including as domestic terrorism. Then you have the chief prosecutor in Charleston. Is she obliged then to look at this as domestic terrorism, or how does that play out?
All right, so you have state and local authorities who were the first responders on the scene, and they make an initial determination that this was a biased hate crime. But as the investigators dig more deeply into the suspect's background and the circumstances surrounding the attack, again, they'll start seeing that there was a belief system behind this. And at that point, the FBI, which is the chief counterterrorism authority here in the United States, will make a determination if it is terrorism or not. And at that point, if they do make that designation, then federal resources will be brought to bear against the suspect and during the prosecution.
And what about just in terms of the public reaction to this? Because we heard from many people saying that it should be looked at in this way, that this isn't just a lone shooter. How important is that?
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about terrorism in the public and even people that I've seen talking on TV. A person's mental state has nothing to do whether an incident is terrorism or not. Whether someone belongs to a terrorist group has no bearing on whether the incident is terrorism or not. Whether it's a mass casualty producing attack, again, a body count has nothing to do with whether it's terrorism or not. It's those three factors that I spelled out earlier. And, you know, to call this a hate crime at this point, knowing all of the things that we know about this suspect, that the fact that he had white supremacy symbolism on his jacket, the fact that he talked amongst his friends for a few years about instigating a race war, this elevates this to a terrorist attack. And when we say it's a hate crime, it makes it seem more insignificant, that it's just a state or local issue. But when we say it's terrorism, it then becomes a national issue. Now